Can I be honest, man? This is a pit of I don't want to be mean. I love Sam. I love Sam so much. But this is not a good response. But also, Sam Seder, this is why I like Sam Seder. This is why I think he's reasonable. This is how I know he's doing this in good faith. I've been told that this was a really good conversation where somebody called in. They called in and they started asking Sam about not being supportive enough to Ukraine. And you know, we've criticized some of the commentary from the Majority Report cast before, but so far I didn't know about Sam Seder himself saying anything that could possibly be even considered problematic about the war. So I'm curious to see what this caller has to say, since I'll be right off the bat extremely sympathetic with him. Let's play.
Look, I don't want to tone police. I'm going to say my piece on Ukraine, and then I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
So obviously I've called in before. I've mentioned my wife is from Ukraine. My mother-in-law, who's sick in the other room, is too. And, when I read on Twitter, there's explosions in Kyiv, I've got to let them know so that they can call people and make sure things are okay. So I understand that there's a personal bias that comes into this, but, and I follow the war probably closer than a lot of people because of that. But from my perspective, the Western weapons are highly effective. They've taken back a huge amount of territory. They're being used to protect the skies, the air defense systems and things that they've received from Europe and the West.
Thanks, Bastion.
But also I just think like Digby said the other day, there is growing global fascism, and it's a serious thing. And the Russian army is at potentially a breaking point. I know that's, a scary position for them to be in, but to me, that's a good thing, that they be defeated. The other day Putin announced annexation of 4 territories. And I don't think you guys covered it, but he basically gave a Tucker Carlson style. There was part of it. It was from Tucker Carlson about how in the West they'll change your kid's gender and they make up pronouns. It's straight out of a Tucker monologue.
It's true.
And
I don't know if we ever got footage of that. We should look for it.
Yeah. So if there's time for, and I know it's not that kind of show, but if there's 20 minutes to talk about Joe Rogan getting a cat box story wrong, it bears mentioning that a nuclear power who's engaged in an unprovoked war of aggression against a country of 45 million people is talking about exterminating LGBT people and using the same terminology as our fascists, who are also in a position of potentially rising back to power. And that's a scary place to be in. And we should be standing up against
this guy's very compelling. He's making a very good argument right off the bat. He's doing a really good job.
And fighting against it. And I just don't think, the idea that I see lots of creative thinking on, well, what if we get involved? What are the worst case scenarios? And you have to do that. If we send weapons, what are the repercussions? What are the things that could happen? Potential blowback, of course. But I don't see any engagement on the left.
On the other side of that.
Okay, let's let Russia wash over a country of 45 million people where there's been mass graves, the destruction of a language and a culture, and a guy who's comparing himself to Peter the Great. Let's let them just get right up to Poland and sort of see what happens. And do we really think he's going to be leftist if we let that happen? Okay, he's going to cut back on the nuclear saber. Sorry, I'm flustered. Saber rattling if we just sort of let this happen. And I don't think he is less dangerous in that scenario. So, and it would be one thing if we supplied weapons in February and they were engaged in this slog, you know, no advancement on either side, then I would understand, frankly, your tone of like, Jesus Christ, like, how long can we supply this sort of conflict? But that's not what's happened at all. They were repelled from Kyiv, kicked all the way back to the Belarusian border. They've taken back huge swaths of territory, and they have all the momentum, and the Russians are fleeing from Kherson, it looks like. So it just seems like a really weird time to be like, this isn't working, it's too expensive. You know, I don't know. And so when I hear, I know she's not there to defend herself, but when I hear Emma say, like,
Emma is the person I would probably direct most of this, a decent amount of this criticism towards. Yeah, I heard her on one of the other panels. I did a video on her on my second channel if you guys want to check it out. It was a majority report, like, panel of like 4 people. She was like, I really disagree with a lot of the things she was saying during that panel. Some context, Dylan. This is one of the longest time callers and friend of the show. Really? So this is an old friend of the show too. Oh, well, that gives it some more heat.
We don't have a dog in this fight, so and our weapons are prolonging the war, so we should withdraw support. What I hear is prolonging the war. In other words, in her mind, the inevitable is that Russia wins. Okay, so we should hasten the victory of the Russians by withdrawing support. And we don't have a dog in this fight is like totally blind to the reality of the conflict. Like, do we not have solidarity with trans kids in Ukraine? Or is it only the ones in Texas? You know, or what about just, and it sounds like, I know this is going to get me labeled as a, you know, shit lib or whatever, but, you know, maybe democracy does matter. Like, you just had an interview about how our own fascists plan to just not look at the rules and invent new rules to not have elections. And that's bad.
All right.
So anyways, that's all I'm going to say. I don't want you guys to think like I'm going to be calling back in every time you have a contrary position or whatever. And I'm not going to try and tone police, but I just felt like it's worth saying that. And Sam, you've been saying people are apathetic. Nobody's paying attention to this. Nobody's questioning the amount of money, but I see it the opposite. I see Ukrainian flags everywhere I go.
Yes.
And people,
yes,
I know, and I talk to. And
when is the last time you've seen this much support for a country we've been sending aid to? Well, usually when you ask Americans about countries we're sending aid to, it's usually there's a response of like, oh, we need that aid here, we need that money here, the money, we should be spending that money on healthcare. But we all know that money that would have been sent in weapons somewhere would not have been spent on healthcare. We all know that. That's how American politics works. You find the world as you find it. This is the first time I've really seen in my lifetime, for sure, like flags of another country, like on every other street, there's at least a single flag I see in my area in Maryland. I saw it in Buffalo, especially in areas bordering Canada, because there's a big Ukrainian community in Canada as well. I've seen them in Pennsylvania. They're especially in places like Ohio. That's why J.D. Vance, when he came out and he said, this is a very, very hardcore MAGA, Trump, won in 2020 type Republican who used to be very anti-Trump and once even called Trump Hitler. Long story. Don't vote for J.D. Vance. Go support Tim Ryan. Anyway, he comes out and he says, I don't even care about Ukraine. I don't even care. Hours later, his campaign releases a statement. What we meant is we really care about Ukraine. We really care. And the reason why is because there's a ton of Ukrainians in Ohio and they realized they were sabotaging their own campaign by saying something that's stupid. So what I'm getting at is, we don't even need to describe it in this way. I can just use hard numbers if nobody wants to use any of these anecdotes, right? 66%. 66% of Americans believe we should send weapons to Ukraine and continue sending weapons to Ukraine. Or increase it. 66. That's up from 53% 3 months ago. Why? Because America loves winners. That's why the numbers are going up. And we see that Ukraine has a chance to win after their victories in Kharkiv and Kherson and around Kiev. And hopefully we can maintain these numbers as we support this nation struggling for its democracy. The numbers are clear. The majority of Americans support Ukraine. The real critique here should not be, oh, maybe we should reel in how many air defense missiles get sent. Because for every air defense missile that gets sent, we're talking about lives being saved here. We're talking about liberation coming earlier here. I want to see the same ferocity I see on domestic issues from progressives, where they're like, take no prisoners, throwing elbows. I want to see that on this liberation struggle. I want to see that there.
And you know, the different places I go, I see high levels of solidarity with the Ukrainian people. And in my mind, that's the way that it should be.
No, I think that's, I think there's no one really talking about, there's without a doubt, I think, broadly speaking, solidarity with the Ukrainian people. But let me just push back on the margins here. Okay.
Oh.
Because I think the question is,
what is this? What is this you've sent me? In the weeks before the Northeast defeat, Russian forces were struggling with surveillance and electronic warfare. They were using off-the-shelf drones flown by barely trained soldiers. Wow. Wow. This is why I think the Iranian drones are such a lifesaver, because they were using shitty drones. It's part of the reason why the Iranians are working so hard to train the Russians, is because nobody knew how to use these things. Because, again, the Russian army is incompetent and corrupt. There's probably a lot less corruption in the Iranian army than the Russian army. And I'm saying that knowing there's a lot of corruption in the Iranian army. Let's go back here.
Let me just push back on the margins here, okay? Because I think the question is, at what point, okay, so, and yes, I think the idea that Russia would come in, decapitate the Ukrainian, leadership, which was their agenda. And I think, frankly, from what I've read, is exactly what we thought was going to happen. They were going to come in within a couple of days. They were going to either exile or kill Zelensky. They were going to put in a puppet regime in Ukraine. They would be able to very effectively, annex and end essentially the conflict in the Donbass and annex, Crimea, et cetera, et cetera. That didn't happen. But I guess the issue is, like, at what point, so does this end when Ukraine gets all of the Donbass back? And I mean, is that and Crimea? Is that what's the end game?
That should be the end game. The end game. And the thing is, this is my main criticism of, I think, a lot of pro-Ukraine commentators. Let's be very clear what the end game is. Crimea, all the Donbass, all of its territory liberated, period. I'm seeing more and more clarity, especially now as we're seeing the Ukrainian army have military successes. That should be, at the very least, the starting position. Because you're going to start your position on giving up the Donbass, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Crimea, no NATO, no defensive agreements to stop another. God, it's weak, man. They're going to get even more out of you, you spineless coward. Not talking to Sam, just talking to the specter that is the appeasers. That should be the starting position, absolutely. And it should be a position that we do not accept anything other than, unless we have basically no choice to.
Is my question. And there doesn't, and
that's the Crimea question, I think, really encapsulates it. Like, I've never said, like, Russia should be allowed to push to Poland, and like didn't take a stance saying that we shouldn't take give any material support to Ukraine. But in this position where, like Reagan says, like they're being pushed back, is it like, okay, retaking Crimea is just like, that's a goal, and questioning that is a problem?
The question is like...
Well, you should say it's a goal, and if you don't achieve it, then it is what it is. But we haven't even... We've seen the Ukrainian army win. There's a chance they could get it back. We should give them all the tools necessary to make an attempt for full liberation. If that fails, we reconsider our options then. Then we walk to the negotiating table from a position of strength and get as much as physically possible, even if it would mean we had some, like, Northern Ireland situation in Crimea. But at the very least, when we have the opportunity, make a go for it.
What is the end game? Like I agree with you. You cannot appease.
Yeah, when you get into a war, fight to win. Then once you've not won, maybe you can get the second best option or whatever else you can get. I mean, it's, you know, when you're in a war, fight to win. I think MacArthur said that.
Putin, but I think part of the reason why people don't, you know, envision the sort of the rolling through Europe scenario that you're talking about was because, for the most part, when Russia did take Crimea in 2014, when they did essentially, you know, semi-occupy these regions, the Donbass, it did not really, it didn't show up on anybody's radar in this country, broadly speaking. Obviously, in certain areas, and there was no sense of like, oh my God, you know, Western Europe is under threat. Now, obviously, Putin's invasion of Ukraine set off some.
To be clear, a full invasion of Ukraine is such a bigger step than funding rebels in the Donbass, or even the annexing of Crimea, which should have been the alarm bell to really start a Western response to over Ukraine. But I mean, honestly, you can blame a lot of this on certain European states like Germany, and honestly, some of the blame can go on the Obama administration as well, and the Trump administration. I mean, he continued those policies, but I mean, you could just say that, look, the news and the media, the political establishment, they got it wrong. They underestimated a threat. They didn't think Putin would go this far. I mean, I didn't think Putin would go this far. And you want to know what? Now that we have a more honest telling of the threat that Putin poses, now is the time to respond. Now there is no more excuses. There can be no more excuses from people saying, oh, well, I don't think Putin really, pressures a decent threat to stability or a decent threat to democracy or a decent threat to Ukraine. You can't say that anymore. You couldn't say that really in 2014, but now no one can say it because you can't claim ignorance. You can't claim ignorance.
Alarm bells. You have 2 new members of NATO that I think nobody would have thought even 2 years ago would ever be members of NATO. But the question is, what's the end game? I mean, is it to get rid of all the separatists in the Donbass?
Yes.
Is it to reclaim Crimea?
Yes.
Is that? And I understand where the argument that
you have to get the war even remotely into the territory of where that's a negotiation that can take place, or where that's even on the table. Okay. And it's not there. So
it may not be there, but
absolutely. Oh my God. This guy just articulated a point that it's very difficult for me to get across to people. The negotiation isn't even in a point where the Russians match reality. Their starting position, according to public statements from the Kremlin at this point, is Ukraine needs to give up Crimea and recognize it internationally as Russian territory, give up Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, recognize all of it as Russian territory, restore water access to Crimea, and agree not to join NATO. And that is the base starting position for negotiations. That is not in line with reality. That is not in line with reality. Even if they start there at a negotiating position and we push them back to just they get all of Donetsk, all of Luhansk, then they've still gained territory from this invasion. Then we're not even pushing them back to the 2014 lines. And the reason, the problem is, we're just not in a position right now in this war where the Russians have regained consciousness. They're still in the dark when it comes to their prospects and how much territory they can actually take and how they're losing territory rapidly. And so we need to make it as clear as possible to the Russians that they have to pull out. We can negotiate their withdrawal. That is what we can negotiate.
But when I've talked about conditions on money, it is to, at the very least, to start to raise the question of like, what happens when we get there? I'm not saying if they're rolling through this and it's a cakewalk by the time they get to Crimea or the Donbass, that we should say, whoa, 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 whoa. You know, we had this plan where, you know, there was going to be, but I mean, I think that it is not unreasonable when you are financing this war where U.S. interests, I mean, just speaking strictly about U.S. interests, okay? And yes, I don't want Russia to come in and oppress transgender kids in Ukraine. Of course not. But in terms of U.S. interests, in terms of these hundreds of millions of dollars, of these billions of dollars, I don't think it's illegitimate to ask, what's the end game? And
right. I think that, I mean, first of all, I mean, I hear you that we, you know, for supplying things, we have a say, or we can attach conditions. I don't know that there haven't been conditions. And I think even like the kinds of support that we've provided.
There has been conditions. There absolutely has been conditions, both public and private. I would just ask, like, what more conditions do you want? That's what I would ask. Like, what are the conditions you would want moving forward then? Because you could say, oh, we want conditions. What are your conditions? Then it's on you to like name the conditions. Because currently, I just think we should be sending them longer range missiles. I think we should be sending them more equipment. That's my position. I don't have any more conditions I want to add. If you got more conditions, I'm open to hear it. I'm sure they would be open to hear it. Just propose them. But you can't just like make a vague like gesture towards conditions. And on the idea of like making your position like, well, what is the end goal? The end goal, when you listen to the Ukrainians, to be very clear, and the Ukrainian government has been clear on this, and I think the American government has signaled very clearly that they believe it's Ukraine's position to negotiate, right? That America will back up Ukraine, and then Ukraine can negotiate with Russia. That's what seems to be the position the United States takes. This guarantees that Ukraine will be able to advocate on its own behalf in negotiations. The Ukrainian government, since, you know, we are backing up the Ukrainian government, has clearly said they want a full withdrawal of the Russian army from Crimea and the Donbass, Zaporozhye, Kherson, all the territory they are occupying. That is their position. So I have no reason to believe that the position is anything other than a full Russian withdrawal. That seems to be the position. So when people ask, like, what's the end game? You should just point to the Ukrainian government's position. Because we back up the Ukrainian government. This is Ukrainian government's position. There you go.
I mean, there was the whole thing with the jet planes or the range of the missiles that we provide, because we want to make sure that what we're using isn't going to be used to, you know, attack mainland Russia or whatever. But I just don't think the conflict is at a position where that's the negotiation that's happened. And I don't know if behind the scenes they've said, look, you know, Crimea is definitely on the table. And I feel like I've heard Zelensky say that they'd be willing to have that negotiation. The problem is, like, you know, you also rob this conflict of the greater context, which is that the invasion started almost 10 years ago. And Putin at every turn has proven completely unwilling to actually abide by any negotiations. So, you know, if you're asking the Ukrainians to, like, okay, well, we'll give you these annexed territories to then just, you know, take it on good faith that that's going to be the end of the conflict, and that, you know, Putin's not going to use it to regroup and launch another attack in another 5 years. So, I mean, he's not a negotiating partner that...
This is another thing. The Russian government has shown themselves to be completely untrustworthy, even when it comes to this specific war. I mean, go back to, of course, they did the Bucharest Memorandum saying that they would agree to recognize Ukraine's territorial sovereignty after Ukraine gives up its nuclear arsenal. Ukraine does so. Then in 2014, after the Euromaidan revolution, a revolution of the people that took power back from a government just trying to outlaw protesting and brutalize protesters, and they, of course, should pull out of the association agreement. Russia invades and annexes Crimea, denies they were doing it the whole time, then supplies separatists in the Donbass, denies they are doing it the whole time, then they do training operations across the border of Ukraine after fighting Ukraine for 8 years through proxy, and then after saying it was just a training exercise and denying that any invasion would ever come, They invade Ukraine after launching false flags. And so now we're supposed to think that if we give the Russians, like Kherson, and we give them Zaporozhye, or even Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea, that if we give them all of this, that they won't come around and do this again in 5 years, and this time we'll just be hearing Sam Seder talking about, well, are we really talking about them not having Odessa? Are we really talking about them not having Kharkiv? And now it's more cities and more territory, more oblasts that are just being sold away, and therefore having more mass graves filled in those cities and towns. Because without Ukraine leaving this war with a defensive alignment in some capacity that would work as a bulwark against another invasion, what guarantee do we have? Because the Russians have shown themselves to be completely untrustworthy. You can say, well, we have to try, and I agree. We have to try, but we don't have to trust them. And the thing you do when you don't trust the person you're negotiating with is you make it impossible for them to violate the thing they agreed to, like having Ukraine join NATO or having a security alignment made with Ukraine after this war. That would mean if Russia invaded again, this time they would meet the full might of the United States military or the full might of all of NATO. It would stop another invasion from happening in the future. But Russia wants to stop that. Why does Russia want to stop that? Because Russia's end goal is the subjugation of all of Ukraine. This is just one stepping stone on that path.
I think
I
you
agree
can sit down with in good faith. And so, like me personally, like Crimea is totally a gray area. And I think the Ukrainians would probably, if the war gets to that point, be willing to say, okay, fine. We're going back to the 2014 borders. And
I mean, the guy's nice. I agree with him on most things, but none of the polling data seems to reflect this. Last polling data showed that I saw said 89% of Ukrainians don't want to make any territorial concessions, and the question implicitly included Crimea. So the war would have to be in a very, very different state, I think, for them to ever accept that. And ultimately, it's their decision.
You know, we'll have another referendum or something in
Do you think the U.S.
Crimea,
let me ask you this: do you think the U.S. I mean, that may be the case in terms of Ukrainians. Do you think the U.S. Do you think that like I mean, let me put it this way: do you think that the Biden administration is providing these funds because they're concerned about transgender kids in Ukraine? Like, I mean, the thing is that I think that like I accept.
I
what
do
you're
think.
saying.
Look, this is what I think. I think it's bullshit to say. I mean, look, I've got my fair share of cynicism.
I say, why do the motivations even matter? Because let's say I do think motivations can matter for what happens after the war, right? I do think motivations matter. I believe ideology matters, right? But I don't understand why those motivations would stop us from saying we should support Ukraine. A libertarian might want to withdraw from Afghanistan for a very different reason than I might want to withdraw from Afghanistan. That doesn't mean we don't withdraw from Afghanistan, or we shouldn't support a withdrawal from Afghanistan, or take the opportunity that is provided through them supporting a withdrawal from Afghanistan. Multiple people can support a good idea for different reasons.
I'm pumping through my veins, but to sit here and say, as I've heard on this show, oh, you know who loves this? Lockheed Martin. Yeah, they probably fucking do, but Lockheed Martin loves 365 days of the year every year because they're rich. Period. Those are the waters they're swimming in. But what I do think, and you've hinted at this, is that we thought they were going to get their asses kicked, and they had a president on the internet saying, like, I'm ready to get killed and martyred, and they're handing out AK-47s in the streets of Kyiv, and we realized, like, they have a well-trained army, and the weapons that we provide can make a difference. And so that's what we've done. Like, are there plenty of cynical actors? Sure, but guess what? Like,
but
was Biden gonna sit there?
No. Listen,
the world
you're
supporting Ukraine. And go, you know what? It's too expensive. We're gonna watch them get killed on live TV.
I have never ever said that we should not have been providing them weapons and material. I have never said that.
And you know what? I agree with you that there's all kinds of cynical interests baked into the cake.
But my point is this. Is that I don't care. I don't care about the cynical interest. Obviously, when
well, you brought it up. So
Base.
But let me just, you're not letting me finish why it's relevant.
Sorry.
It's relevant because while you may say, and maybe the Ukrainian people broadly may say, we're willing to negotiate about Crimea. We're willing to negotiate about various parts of the Donbass. We're in a zone now where, and like I say, I don't think the U.S. thought it would be. I don't think the administration thought we would be here. Everyone was surprised, I think, on some level, that A, Ukraine's response was so strong, and B, that the Russian military was so really a paper tiger in many respects. And there's no doubt in my mind that if you were to negotiate Crimea or not, or vice versa, like at the end of this, and we don't know where the end is, and that's my point, but at the end of this, Putin's not going to be in a position to sort of regather and go out. I mean, they've lost 100,000 troops. Their military is decimated, which is why they were relying on Iranian advisors to come and show them how to send their kamikaze drones over there. I have no sympathies for the Russian military, but I guess my point is that, like, the advantage that it is in the interest of the Biden administration at one point, and of the U.S. National security state and foreign policy apparatus, at one point, I don't think we're there yet, but at one point, pressing that advantage may supersede at one point what, frankly, is in the best interests of Ukraine. And
at what point? I gotta hear. Wait. It is true that, like, at some point it could supersede. For example, let's say we're like, okay, now we've taken back Crimea and the Donbass. Now we need to overthrow Putin. Let's invade and take Moscow. Then yeah, of course. But I would like to hear Sam say that point, because I have a point, and I think it would be if we're like, okay, we've won the war, but let's keep going and take out Putin. To me, that would be going past the point that helps Ukraine, because then Russia might actually be in a scenario where they would use nuclear weapons, and the odds of them using it is actually high, unlike the scenario we're in actually right now. So for me, right, that would be my point. And so you can say there is a point, but I would just like to hear where that point is. Because for most Ukrainians, that point is not taking back Ukraine or taking back Odessa, or taking back the Donbass, taking back Luhansk and Donetsk, taking back Zaporozhye, taking it back Kherson. It's not going to be that for them. It's going to be probably invading Russia. And so that's the point I would put forth as well. So I just want to know what would Sam's point be? Because you need to, like, say the point. You can't just say there is a point. Well, yes, there's a point with that for every war. It's kind of pointless to mention unless you, like, define what you think that point would be. And for me, that's invading the rest of Russia. Russian territory past Ukraine, internationally recognized Ukrainian territory. Matt Binder is cool as fuck. And hey, do not advertise, but check out his YouTube channel. His 2 streams a show a week are great. I love Matt Binder. I love Matt, man. He's great. And he's one of the few who gave pushback on the panel that he did with the rest of them. And I really appreciated it. It was good pushback. I like Matt.
Like you say, we don't know if there are conditions that are placed on the Ukrainians now with these weapons. We don't know. And all I'm saying is that I do not think it is inappropriate, whether it's us entering into a conflict or us financing a conflict. I don't think it's inappropriate for the American public to want to hear an articulation as to whereabouts are the end game. And I understand you don't want to say, like, well, we're going to finance this up until, the border of Crimea. I understand you don't want to be explicit about it, but to have no discussion whatsoever in this country about the end game or the goals behind this, they're unarticulated, I think is very, very dangerous. Because
I'm fine with that conversation, but what I'm hearing a lot is that that's the only conversation that some people want to have. And I've heard on this show a 20-minute conversation multiple times where at the very end you'll be like, I guess Putin did go a little too far. Like that's on the back end of the conversation you want to have about, isn't this already too expensive? And even with Digby at the end, it was sort of like, oh yeah, I guess there were some mass graves. And to me, like, you know, the conflict will get to the point that you're talking to, but like as massive amounts of territory are being retaken and a fascist military is being defeated.
Listen, how many tens of thousands of people did we help kill in Yemen? Like, I mean, you're asking.
We're not talking. Sam,
no,
we're not.
No, I'm not.
Why are we on Yemen? I'm sorry. Oh my God. Okay. Let's wait. Let's be good faith Andys. But it sounds like this guy's got Sam. He's got him here. It really sounds like he's got him here. And Sam is just like grabbing for what any other topic he can to say, well, America did a bad here. Or do you think the people involved have good interests at heart? Like, none of this matters. None of this matters. Somebody can be involved for something for the wrong reason and still be right about the issue. If I said, never mind. Okay, let me think of a better one. If I said I was against 9/11 because I didn't like the traffic, I was still right that 9/11 was bad, even if I had a stupid reason.
But no. But you're talking
about Iraq too.
No. Yeah.
Let's talk about Iraq.
Well, no, I have talked about Iraq. But my point is this, is that like you're complaining about the nature of the coverage in the conversations here. And if you're going to do that, if you're going to talk about the nature of the coverage in the conversations, then you also, then what we're talking about is how we're covering it and the questions that we're asking. And in that instance, it's like, we're not emphasizing the mass graves in Ukraine relative to what? Relative to what? Because they don't exist in a vacuum. There are tens of thousands of Yemenis that we have actively facilitated their deaths, and we haven't dedicated weeks or hours of shows on that.
I'm talking.
Okay. That's fair, and somebody could say you can concentrate on this issue or that issue, but the problem is that when Sam Seder does talk about this, or when his crew talks about this, it's in the aspect of, oh, you know, we need to go around here and negotiate, and it's not in the terms of like pushing the advantage. Not to mention the fact that the amount of deaths that have happened in Ukraine in under a year is nearly the amount of deaths that Yemen has suffered for the entirety of the last 10 years of fighting. Ukraine is an especially bloody and deadly conflict. And I think people don't sell this enough. More people have died in Ukraine than have died in Palestine over the last 50 years. More people have died in Ukraine in almost in under a year than nearly all the people who have died in Yemen over the last 10. If you extended this war to the same length as the Syrian civil war at the current estimates, current rates of deaths, which obviously are going to change, it would exceed the amount of deaths of the Syrian civil war. I mean, this is an especially bloody and brutal war because it involves so many people. And so I do think it does deserve a decent amount of coverage. Not saying that Yemen should get less coverage or that all these other places should get less coverage. I think Yemen should get more coverage, for God's sakes. But this is a very, very brutal war. Like an abnormally brutal war for the last 20 years. The only other war of this scale that I can think of would probably be Iraq. And more people, honestly, more people are dying in Ukraine now than died after the 28-day invasion of Iraq at this point in the war, I think. No, I'm sure. I'm positive of it. And on top of that, maybe what the Tatmadaw did in Myanmar, maybe. And when it comes to the Rohingya Muslim community. Anyway, let's get back to the Sam Seder segment.
About within the universe of Ukrainian conversation. That's what I'm talking about.
Yes, but it's not fair for you to limit, like in the you know, like we're not putting enough emphasis on mass graves in Ukraine. Well, there's a lot of things that we don't put emphasis on. And I understand, like, you know.
No, but
But
yeah,
let me just jump in, guys. Like, this is my point about like making sure that trying.
I think the problem is that the things that are emphasis that is put on when talking about Ukraine is misaligned. Like, if every time Yemen came up, my thing I put emphasis on was like, yeah, but the Houthis are also really, really bad. Did I just mention that the Houthis are bad? Like, I mean, like when I mean, of course, Saudi's bad or whatever, but the Houthis are really bad, which is true. People like when they talk about Yemen, they will fail to recognize that the Houthi rebels are horrific. They torture people, they commit atrocities, but the Saudi government has done just so much more damage to the civilian population of Yemen. It's just like an undeniable fact. And that's on top of the fact that the Saudi government can't win. And so that's what I focus on, because that's I think the bigger issue to me, and is also the thing that I can have more of an impact on as an American. Where in Ukraine, I think the big thing I can have an impact on as American is we can provide them the tools necessary to get rid of the occupier.
Trying to negotiate some sort of peace as an emphasis isn't because I think Putin's a worthwhile partner in that. I think you're probably right about his motives. It's about U.S. credibility, frankly, Reagan. I agree with you when you don't like seeing Evo Morales embrace Putin. I think that's bad. Evo Morales was cooed by America, right? Like, we don't have a trust with this sort of stuff. So I think that's why I think it's important to have those sorts of conversations. And sure, we can emphasize like the atrocities, but
I don't know if Evo Morales was cooed by America or cooed by domestic far right in Bolivia. Either way, it was bad, but we don't know that the United States did that. People kind of just say that now, even though they don't have enough evidence for it. They'll point to the Organization of American States, but that wasn't the soldiers who like marched into the organization or building that tried to arrest Evo Morales or any of that. Anyway, we'll continue.
Atrocities happen the longer wars are prolonged. And so I don't think you continue wars to like vengeance for atrocities.
Well, I mean, that goes back, I guess, to the point I made earlier. I don't see Western supplied weapons as prolonging the war. I see them as hastening the victory of what is sort of plainly the correct side of this war, in my opinion, and the defeat of an evil fascist empire. So, I mean, I hate to put it in such black and white terms, but that's how this happened to go down. And I'm not saying, oh, you need to lead every show with mass graves, or that you have to have the mass grave report where you compare all mass graves in the world. What I'm saying is, in the context of mentioning Ukraine, it seems.
What a depressing show idea. Do you want that to be Thursdays? Wait, no, Monday. Mass Grave Mondays with Dylan Burns TV. Mass Grave Mondays.
To only come up with a sigh and an eye roll about how much it's costing and how soon can we end it, instead of saying, in my opinion, the argument should be made for intervention. And if you don't think so, then make that argument, instead of just sort of rolling around and like, well,
but you know, I think to
we need
extent,
to announce now somehow, like the end.
Listen,
you just mentioned that.
I feel really strongly that regardless of whatever conflict we get involved in, that it should be completely articulated as to what the parameters are and what we're willing to go. Are we willing, let's put it this way, right now, after spending billions and billions of dollars on weapons, there has never been, like, are we willing to drop a nuke on Moscow? I hope not. Are we willing to drop a nuke on Russian civilians? I mean, like, I want to know what the parameters are for this thing that we're engaged in. And yes, the idea that within the context of this country, there's not enough coverage about that Ukraine is in the right here. I'm sorry, that's not the case. I mean, I watched the news. There is no debate whatsoever about the parameters or the conditions.
No one is suggesting that we nuke Moscow. The furthest like stuff you're gonna get from the pro-Ukraine crowd is gonna be like a John Bolton, maybe we should try to take out Putin guy. But even he is not gonna be like, let's nuke Moscow. John Bolton's wrote multiple articles about what his policy would be, and it's to assassinate Putin, take out the government, and work with rebels, right? That's like the furthest you can find. And those people are on the fringes. The fringes. So I think if you ask most people are going to be like, we will go as far as it takes when it has to go to like weapons, sending weapons over, longer range missiles. Basically, nobody wants to put troops on the ground. And I think the furthest scenario, the closest we can ever get to getting involved, is if Russia did end up doing the very unlikely scenario of dropping a bomb, a nuclear bomb, in Ukraine. We might do a conventional strike against the specific division that carried out the order. That, I think, is the furthest we would probably go during the Biden administration. Like, I don't know. Like, I think those would be the parameters, in my view.
Conditions or whatever. It is just the money flows. There has not been, as far as I can tell, there hasn't been even a touch on the gas. The only thing that I have seen is like some vague notion that if the Republicans get in power, they're going to tap the brakes on this. I don't think they will. But and I don't think that's necessarily preferable at all. I just don't think it is healthy for this country to be putting money out the door like that without any conversation, because it sets the precedent for it allows for things like Yemen. It allows for, I mean, you set the precedent that we can fund. I have seen, and I am not an apologist for Putin. I have seen literally a dozen of Putins that this country has been able to rally around to fight one war or another in one fashion or another. I'm not saying that Putin is a good guy. Obviously, I don't think I've ever said a decent word about Putin in 18 years of doing this professionally.
Can I be honest, man? This is a pit of I don't want to be mean. I love Sam so much, but this is not a good response. Well, we got to set the parameters, because if we don't, then we'll send more weapons to Yemen. What? You can want to support one country in a war and not want to support another. We can send weapons to Ukraine and not send weapons to Yemen. We can say, yeah, one is a liberation struggle, the other is a mass starvation campaign and war that has moved not at all in the last like 8 years. Like the fucking Saudis just can't win. They suck. And they're starving the whole country. You can say I support Ukraine and I don't support Yemen. I think that's perfectly fine. And also, you know, I mean, we have supported some terrible people, but again, that does not mean, since now this issue of value, this struggle against a real dictator here, a real bad guy, should be ignored because we've supported other people who are also bad, especially since we're probably never going to get another opportunity to push the Russians out of Ukraine again. Like, this, the reason it deserves a lot of attention right now is there'll probably never be another opportunity like this where all the factors came together perfectly to help Ukraine struggle against the invader.
But what I do know about this country is that if they get into the mode of pouring money into wars, it just goes and goes. And it may not be an issue in the context of this conflict with Ukraine and Russia, but the idea that we can present at least one, and I think it's reasoned, I really do think it's reasonable to present like some notion that we should not willy-nilly, without any type of public conversation on the merits or the conditions or the parameters of funding a war. Never mind even the aspect of you know, the potential nuclear escalation. I frankly think that is somewhat overblown on some level.
Amen. Thank you, Sam. It's overblown. But also, Sam Seder, this is why I like Sam Seder. This is why I think he's reasonable. This is how I know he's doing this in good faith. But what he just said before that is, in my opinion, the weakest argument you can make in favor of anything. And I don't say that like to oversell it, but when I hear somebody talk about supporting something or talk about an issue, the weakest defense of it you can ever make is, well, we can have a conversation. It's the type of thing I hear about, like, well, do you want to get rid of gay marriage? Well, I'm not saying we should get rid of gay marriage. but we can have a conversation about it. It's like something somebody will say when they don't really have a good argument for it, but they want to like still normalize like this guy. Like all I'm trying to say is, yes, we can have a conversation, but of course we can have a conversation. This is the United States where yes, we can talk. We have freedom of expression. We can talk. I just don't I don't understand. Yes, you can discuss things. I don't understand it. But you could say that about literally any topic. Like, we can have a conversation about sending weapons to Myanmar, I mean, if you want. But acknowledging that fact, I don't think changes anything.
On some level. But just of any conflict, I just think that is a very bad thing to train the American public to do. And it is a
right.
And so today it may be for a just reason, but there is no distinguishing between today for a just reason and yesterday for Yemen in a completely unjust reason, or tomorrow.
But the problem is, I understand what he's saying. I guess what he's trying to say is we need an American public that is active in foreign policy and is asking questions and is having conversations instead of just accepting the establishment media line. Okay, that's fair. But that's what we're doing. Right now, Tucker Carlson every night goes on his show and talks about how Zelensky is like the leader of the degenerate West and Russia. And he says explicitly, I am rooting for Russia. If you don't believe me, look it up. Tucker Carlson explicitly said on his program, I am rooting for Russia, the most popular cable news show in the United States. It is the most popular news show in all of America. And he said that. That is certainly having a conversation. But even under those conditions, knowing that Russia is trying to spread misinformation in the United States, trying to undercut American support for Ukraine, the majority of Americans still support Ukraine. The conversation was had. The polling data and our politicians seem to agree, support Ukraine. The conversation can continue, but we've talked. We've had the conversation. I don't know what this request for conversation is. I don't want to say concern trolling, but I'm trying to like think of a better word to use how to describe this.
Borrow in, I don't know, some Western African country.
There is distinguishing, and that's like why we have smart shows like this one, so that we can distinguish when it's justified and when it's not. And I think because you admitted it a minute ago, that there's like really basic operational reasons why you wouldn't come out and say, you know what? We're thinking next spring we're going to get kind of tired of this. Like, there's obvious reasons why Biden's not going to come out and say April 1st and, that's it for us. We're tapping out.
I get that.
Okay, well, so it seems obvious.
But you don't think there should be any conversation about this at all?
Well, I think...
I don't... Then what's your parameters? Like, my parameter is we should support them until the Ukrainian people have had enough of fighting and we've tried every avenue to liberate them possible within the grounds of reason, as in, i.e., no literally nuking Moscow, right? Those are my parameters. Like, what's his? Like, I think those are fine parameters.
We can have conversations about, like, to what extent should we get involved in any conflict, of course. But then that's, I guess, kind of my point. I would like the conversation to be about that. Like, when is it justified? Like, is this a justified intervention to send HIMARS so that they can blow up ammo dumps, far away? Or air defense systems.
Listen,
like, we can have that conversation about any of these.
It just, in my experience, I thought when the UN, the entire UN Security Council, approved protecting Benghazi from Gaddafi, okay, and China, Russia, U.S., whoever else was sitting on the Security Council at the time, obviously France and England, signed off on protecting the people in Benghazi because Gaddafi had sworn that he was going to level the city, kill several hundred thousands of people. I thought that was a legitimate exercise, both because you're stopping a potential genocide, and the only way of assessing that, in my mind, was to basically outsource that obligation to the UN. If China, Russia, and the United States can agree on something, or the entire Security Council can agree on it, then that to me was like, I definitely believe that we should be using military to stop genocide. But the hard part is, like, how do you establish that? And I deferred to the UN out of my desire for internationalism. And that went super, super sideways. And I think there should be, when we are financing a war, we should at the very least be discussing these things as a nation. And if this discussion was super prominent in this country,
I guess like my main thing would be, like, I understand the criticisms he's making, but number one, the reason why Gaddafi like fell out of power wasn't just because we protected Benghazi. It was the air campaign following the protecting of Benghazi that led to, look, I don't want to get too into it. Anyway, the problem of instability in Ukraine once Russia leaves is not going to be an issue. Like, it's just not. They have a stable government. Like, Zelensky is a very, very popular guy, and they have a functioning bureaucracy. They have a democracy. A young democracy, but they have a democracy. I don't think there's really an equivalence here. Again, like, all I would ask is, like, what are his ranges? Like, what would he be willing to do or not be willing to do? And I would be willing to do basically anything outside of direct American troops on the ground and nuking Moscow, because those are two things that would really break with precedent to a degree that would be very dangerous. Sending weapons, sending longer range missiles, and a conventional, and the longest that you can get me on this, the furthest you can get me on this, is a conventional strike in response to a nuclear weapon, if that was to be used, which it most likely won't. But, like, outside of that, like, those are the parameters. So, like, you can make a request for parameters. I guess the question should be, what is Sam's parameters?
On cable news or in the newspapers, I would feel less of an obligation to entertain that discussion because it's already being discussed. But I mean, it's not. And so, and again, where, I land on this, I have never said that we should stop funding this. I have never said that we should allow Putin to do X, Y, or Z. And it is really just, I think that when we are funding a war, whether we think it's a just war or an unjust war, we need to have a public conversation about it, and it's just simply not happening.
Yeah. All right. I love you guys.
Love you too, Reagan.
All right, man. Feel better. If it makes you feel good, all the IMers are in favor of what you're saying.
Yeah, you win.
You won.
He did win. He is true. I don't know. I think Sam is being a little, I don't want to say concern trolly, but it feels a little concern trolly. It feels like in that realm, right? Like, oh, we need to have a conversation about the type of support we're giving you. I mean, yes. I mean, yeah. But we've had that conversation since the war started. Like, what more conversation needs to be had? Do we need, like, a Twitter poll? Do we need, like, an official Twitter poll? Like, I don't know what he means by that, I guess.
Let's see. Adam from Indiana. If this wasn't Reagan calling you, you would tell the listener to go watch another show. He wants to dictate what topics you're talking about and how you frame it. That's maybe correct.
But he's a good caller.
Yeah, no, but he's a good caller. He's contributed to more to the show than half the time than I have.
He actually does work for the show, basically.
All right, let's read some of these IMs because this is guy hijacks the show. It's classic.
He's good.
Trying to get sympathy with the whole COVID thing too.
By the way, it's very difficult with the internet. I think a lot of people take criticism as a dislike of a person. I love Sam. Let me be clear. Sam, the Majority Report, is probably my favorite internet political show. And that's saying a lot because I watch a lot of internet political shows because that's my job, right? He's my favorite. He is my favorite. So, to be clear, I have a very high opinion of Sam Seder to usually see above the partisan hackery of other people. So that's why I'm kind of, I just want to reiterate that people walking away from this should not walk away from this thinking Sam Seder is like a hack or something. He isn't. I think he just kind of fell in a hole here, that's all. Left is best, man. Left is best.
That was smart. I mean, look, I do think that there is a conversation that we probably have not had on this program to any serious degree as to like the implications of Russia leading, exporting, being part of a sort of global fascist movement. They certainly are part of it. And I would suspect that if they were successful in those first couple of months in the invasion, the first couple of weeks, the first couple of months of the invasion, we would be talking much more about that than we are now. Like, speaking for myself, I react to not only the facts as I absorb them through reading and from, consuming media, but because of the nature of both how I entered in this business and how we're situated, I am influenced in terms of like what I think is important for me to talk about by the larger context of the conversation that's happening. And I think there are certain important things to be considered in the context of us funding the Ukrainians to fend off this invasion. There is no doubt in my mind that the invasion of Ukraine is an imperialist project by Russia. Do I think that the expansion of NATO was problematic? I did, completely divorced from this issue, frankly. But do I think it was provocative? It could have been mildly provocative, but do I think it in any way?
By the way, man, can I just say, dude, I've never seen more respect for NATO in my whole life. I've seen more pro-NATO people, or like more people sympathetic to NATO in my whole life. Like, I've never seen this amount of love for NATO until this war happened.